In 2008, 10 years ago, Steve Jobs took the stage and announced the MacBook Air. Just like all the other Apple products at the time, like the iPhone the year before, Apple really was ahead of the curve. This is the state of Mac 2018. However, to talk about the Mac side of things, you first need to touch on the Windows side of things and see how that aspect of computing is going before you talk about the Apple side. In 2018, you have so many different offerings from both the Windows side and the Mac that really it comes down to a choice of the operating system that you want to go with. If your budget isn't inexhaustible and you want to have a gaming laptop, then there are two things that you can go with. You can go with the Aero 15X from Gigabyte or the MSI GS65, which is another gaming laptop that is highly acclaimed and will run applications and gaming extremely well compared to an equally priced MacBook. However, if you're looking for a computer that is a laptop, mind you, and you want to be able to do business or do schoolwork on it, you're going to want to go with an Ultrabook. So on the Windows side of things, you have obviously the MateBook X Pro from Huawei, which is perhaps the best Ultrabook, and it is extremely competitively priced at the moment. You also can choose the Dell XPS 13, which is another fantastic option from Dell, but you are going to pay more for it, and the build quality, even though it is nice for sure, and it does use carbon fiber, it's just not my personal taste when it comes to a premium priced laptop. And if you're someone who's looking for a laptop that'll be used exclusively for typing and you don't really care as much for the display and your budget is bigger and you don't really mind not having a dedicated graphics card, so basically you're not doing any in-depth photo editing or video editing, then the ThinkPad from Lenovo can also be a great choice. And from what I've heard about the keyboard, it's fantastic for people who are, let's say, freelance writers or are programmers and are on the computer and typing all day. And they're not at home and they aren't on a mechanical keyboard that they can just type away on for the rest of the day. On the Windows side of things, you get much more options between different designs from the different manufacturers. So you can go with the LG Gram if you want something thin and light. You can go with the XPS 13 or 15 if you want to have a 4K display, because that's not obviously offered on the MacBook laptops. Or if you want to have something that's very similar to an Apple experience, but also get nicer processors and be a newer generation of it, then you can obviously go with the MateBook X Pro, which is a fantastic option, especially if you've been on MacBook Pros for a very long time and have just been upset with what Apple's been doing recently. So before we actually start before we talk about the Macs in 2018, we need to talk about the last few years with what Apple's been doing with their favorite acclaimed computer division. No. Before we talk about the Macs in 2018, we first need to talk about In order to talk about the 2018 state of Macs, you first need to talk about the past few years with Apple's computer division. Many people feel as though the Macs have been neglected since Steve Jobs left, and in some ways I would agree, but in others I wouldn't. I think the best example would have to be the 13-inch MacBook Air. Apple has not changed the design since 2010. It is an 8-year-old computer. Imagine if, let's say, Motorola or even Apple themselves sold a phone like the iPhone from 2010 and had not changed the design. I think people would be very upset about that. And I think it's absolutely ridiculous that 8 years later, Apple is still using basically the same laptop that came out in 2008. One other ridiculous thing that Apple has just completely neglected is the Mac Mini. In 2014, after quite some time, Apple obviously updated the machine, but that's been the only update since. They still sell the Mac Mini for $500. It's absolutely ridiculous. You can go on YouTube and find a $500 budget gaming PC that's going to be substantially faster than the Mac. I mean, yes, you're not going to get the Mac operating system, but still, I mean, if you consider what you're going to get with an equally priced Windows desktop machine, even a budget one, a $500 one, you're going to get way more performance on the Windows side of things, and I don't really understand why anyone would try to get a Mac Mini at this time. So now we kind of have to talk about the things that Apple has actually shown some care about. And the first thing would have to be the MacBook Pro. Now, originally when I was obviously planning to make this video, Apple had not announced the 2018 Macs. And that was a big problem at the time because they were running 7th gen processors, they were dual core on the 13-inch, even at the highest i7 models, which is completely ridiculous, in 2018. I mean, most of the Windows laptops, even ones that are substantially cheaper than the MacBooks, all have quad core, and I just think that was kind of ridiculous. However, a few days ago, Apple did decide to actually update the MacBook Pro line. Obviously, you've got some issues with regards to the butterfly keys, and even though I have heard and read from iFixit that they've made some slight changes to the 3rd generation butterfly keys that will actually allow dust to be kept out of the system, which means that you probably are not going to have as many issues with the keyboard if you've been using the computer for an extended period of time. However, people still have a ton of issues with it. Most people, including me, think the touch bar is a complete gimmick. I mean, if Steve Jobs was still alive, the chance that they would actually have them, and not only keep them, would be pretty much 0%. And I just think that if Steve Jobs was still alive, the MacBook Pro line would be very different. Now, I'm going to take a little bit different approach because I think the addition of 4 USB-C ports on the touch bar models, I think that's actually a wonderful thing. I'm also really big on the way products look, and because of that, it looks substantially better because of Apple's decision to only use USB-C on the new MacBooks than it did in the past. Now, if you look at a 2015 MacBook Pro or before, they look extremely outdated. Yes, you don't have to live a dongle heating life, but still, you don't get the beautiful design of the new MacBook Pros. Now, there's one MacBook product that is actually pretty decent for what it tries to be, and that's obviously just the 12-inch MacBook. I've always actually been a pretty big fan of them, even though personally I would never buy one because they're not spec'd up enough in a way compared to similarly priced MacBook Pros, and especially not versus the Windows side of things. For what they try to be, they do it extremely well. They're both thin and light, and it's absolutely remarkable that Apple was able to get so much performance in such a thin, wonderful design. Now, that's something that Steve Jobs would do, but to take the decision to make those keys butterfly switches and then put it in their professional MacBook Pro line, I just don't think that was the right decision for Apple to do. The Mac Pro, we're going to talk about that next year because Apple is going to update it, but needless to say, it really, really needs an update. Now we go on to the iMacs. This is a Mac lineup that I've actually always been a fan of, but there's been one problem in the past few years, and it's just Apple's decision to not change the fundamental design of the computer. They could substantially lower the bezels like many of the other computer manufacturers like the Surface screen. Nope. One of my major problems with the new iMacs is the fact that over the past 10 years, they really have not tried to change the design at all in the slightest. And after all this time, it's very frustrating because the company of Steve Jobs that was constantly supposed to be innovating hasn't. And that's a problem. If you look at the colorful iMacs from back in the late 90s and then compare them to the iMacs of the late aughts, then that's also a big indicator of the change in Apple from that time versus now. And the reason is they substantially changed in the 2000s, but in the 2010s, and we're in 2018 now, they've remained basically the same. However, the value from them is not too bad. If you look at the 1299 21.5 inch display, you're gonna get something that's absolutely stunning. You get a 4K display, which on its own would be hundreds of dollars if you wanted to attach that to a Windows computer. Yes, you are botched down because Apple really does lock down their systems, but in a way, if you're looking for something that's very simple and very pleasing to the eye, then you really can't go wrong with the cheaper iMacs. And if you decide to get the 27-inch, you're obviously going to get that beautiful 5K display, and you will be very, very happy that you decided to go with that option. You see, there's actually a point to getting Macs over Windows. If you're the average consumer and aren't tech savvy, like I'm assuming some of you are, then One of the things about it is you don't really have to, and yes, of course they run into issues sometimes, but you don't experience the Windows kind of bugs that if you don't know what you're doing, then you can really ruin your computer experience on Windows. So, instead of getting a computer that is subpar with tons of issues that you don't really know how to work, you can get the whole Mac experience, and especially if you have an iPhone and use iCloud consistently, really the Mac and the Apple ecosystem with iOS combined work extremely well compared to whatever kind of system you could set up on Windows. The iMac Pro, which is the last thing in the Apple lineup that they offer for Macs. The thing is, they've obviously had some issues with it because if you go on YouTube, and if you're watching this video, you've probably seen them, some of the tech YouTubers have actually found several issues with them, especially regarding Apple supporting them. But that aside, they are nicely spec'd. You obviously get beautiful displays. Yes, there's the question of why would you not just get the 27-inch with the 5K display over the iMac Pro? Sure, there are questions like that. But if money's not really an issue, the iMac Pro is an extremely nice computer. To wrap things up, the Mac is really the brainchild of Steve Jobs' vision. Sure, he found more success with the iPhone. However, there was always something special about the Macintosh compared to how they are now. They always have been more fluid, and the system has just been more special compared to the Windows side of things. You always knew you were getting a wonderful, well-made product when you get the Macs. The difference is now, Windows has caught up substantially. Sure, if you do have an iPhone and are a part of the Apple ecosystem, you might as well go with the Mac because it really kind of closes things off and works extremely well. However, if you decide to have a computer that actually runs well and are willing to sacrifice a few little bugs for a system that is substantially more powerful compared to an equally priced Macintosh, then you might as well go with Windows. My hope for the next year until mid-2019 is that Apple starts to revert back to the old ways of things, or at least make some strides towards it. From what I know now, apparently Apple is going to have some big updates for the Mac lineup later this year, but as of right now, one can only hope.